Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Trees, a podcast presented by Cedarwood Financial Partners. I am your host, Alex Murphy, and today I am extremely excited to have a guest that I think is going to bring a ton of value to you. It is Dr. Mark Tenenbaum. He is a thought leader in advisor well-being and a key voice behind the work at Kitsus. With a background in psychology, he focuses on the intersection of mental health, performance, and financial advice, helping advisors build not just more successful practices, but more fulfilling lives. His insights center on resilience, purpose, and redefining success in a profession often driven by metrics. Mark, really glad to have you today. We're
Alex,
going
it's
to
great to be
be
here.
awesome. Today, we're going to dive into the advisor well-being study that you did for 2025, what's improved, what's driving it, and what advisors should actually do with this information. Let
Awesome. That
me
sounds great.
Fantastic. I'm really excited after going through the study. Why don't we kick it off and just say, what were you most surprised about from this study versus studies in the past?
Sure. Well, maybe how I'll lead just briefly by way of background is explaining how we measured well being in the report. Folks will be able to follow my commentary throughout the rest of the recording. So, we measured well being with a metric called the Cantril ladder. It's used by Gallup, it's used by the World Happiness Report. And essentially, it just asks respondents to place themselves on a ladder ranging from the worst possible like that 0 to the best possible like that 10. So that's how we primarily measured well being in the report. And then, based on that metric, what surprised us most is really just how much advisor well being improved from past editions of the survey. So, just maybe to briefly illustrate this. So, we classified respondents with the highest levels of well being, those who reported a 9 or a 10 on the Cantril ladder, is thriving. And the share of advisors who we classed as thriving jumped from 13% in 2023 to 23% in 2025. So I'm happy to unpack some of the reasons behind that lift in advisor well-being if you'd like. But just at that high level, the sheer jump and improvement in advisor well-being in the latest edition of the report is certainly what stood out to me the most.
Wow. Yeah, that's a huge jump. So, at a high level, why don't you just dive into what's driving that improvement?
Yeah. So a good chunk of the improvement, although not all of it, that we identified in the latest report is because in 2023, the year of the previous edition of the report, that was a particularly bad year for advisor well-being, and thus we saw a little bit of a natural recovery since 2023. So specifically in 2023, we saw a lot of challenges with post-COVID normalization, where a lot of advisory firms struggled returning to the office after being remote for some time, such as, for example, some clients being eager just to get back there in the conference room in person, while others being particularly cautious. And there are a lot of those because advisory firms tend to have older clientele. And then just in addition, 2022 was a down year in the market. So that may have had some impact as well. But I will note, so while this recovery from 2023 is part of the story, that's not the entire story. So one stat that's interesting that we note in the report is that historically, right, this is now the fourth edition of our advisor well-being study. And historically, advisor well-being has been right in line with well-being of the general US adult population. But in 2025, advisor well-being jumped up to such a degree that advisors now have distinctively higher levels of well-being than the US general population overall. And this is for a few reasons, but the primary reason why is just that, as you know, advisors have really more autonomy than ever before compared to previous generations of advisors in just tailoring their career to build the kind of meaningful practice that they want. So just for example, you see this in the share of advisors operating exclusively out of independent RIAs who have the freedom to serve the clients that they want to serve and carve out that specific niche to adopt the service model that they want to adopt. So we're seeing a growing number of online only firms, for example, as well as just use the tech that helps them fit that vision. So I would say just the steady increase in the amount of autonomy advisors have just to build the kind of practice that they want and makes them happy is one reason why advisors have now reached a point where they have distinctively higher well-being than the typical US adult.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think it's specifically in this industry where I would have guessed that mental health wasn't the best for a long time.
Mhm.
That's really neat to hear. And I wonder, do you think you mentioned the RIA space? Do you think that the growth of independence is strongly correlative with what you're saying there?
Absolutely. The autonomy and flexibility afforded to advisors in that independent channel, again, just more choice in who you serve and how you serve them. Your again in your service model and your tech, et cetera, really helps. Now, th- I'm not saying we're on some sort of teleological path towards progressively higher well-being. So there's definitely some storm clouds. So just one example of this is we're seeing it, all over, just the rise of mega RIAs, which are increasingly incorporating the kind of rigid structures that used to be common in the BD channel. And then similarly, we as I'm sure your viewers know, there's been a massive influx of M&A activity in the industry, and that when firms take on outside capital, that often comes with a pressure to standardize service offerings for consistency and repeatability and supposedly to improve efficiency. But the end result of that is that many advisors in the independent channel, because they're now working for large mega firms, because maybe the firms have taken on outside capital, they're now often feeling a bit constrained or unable to serve clients in the sort of personalized, mission driven ways that drove them to independence in the first place.
That's really interesting. So, do you see this as potentially a cyclical issue where they're actually going back into an environment that many escaped?
Oh, absolutely. As I noted, and as given the rise of mega RIAs and the growing number of RIAs that have taken on outside capital every single year, there is yet another record in M&A activity. I just saw the article for 2026. We're on track for another record breaking year. That yes, we are. The RIA world used to sort of just be the wild west of advisors who wanted to construct their own practice, build it up from scratch, choose their tech, et cetera. And then now again, we're starting to see standardization in that space.
I think that's really important for the listeners who are considering independence as they consider all the options. I think RIA historically has meant most freedom, right? And so as they analyze it, they need to make sure they're considering they might be walking into more of a similar situation than they thought if they're going with the mega RIA strategy. And there's pros and cons to all, right? But I
Agreed.
think if freedom's at the top of your list, that's pretty important to know.
Absolutely.
Well, why don't we walk through one by one, a- in a practical way, the key factors that you've listed? So there's 5 key factors, right? Why don't we start with experience? So why does experience have such a strong impact on well-being?
Sure. And then just to briefly provide some context for your listeners, so we put out these large book length research studies, and most recently our research study on advisor well-being, where we show the relationship, just the mere correlation between well-being and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of different variables, totaling over 30,000 words of commentary. And what we did, so we showed the relationship between well-being and lots of these different variables. So we wanted to investigate which of these variables really matters more than the others, which ones stand out in driving advisor well-being. So we ran a whole bunch of statistical analyses, which spat out a bunch of factors, which fall into 5 buckets. So as you just noted, Alex, that's experience, working at the right workplace, autonomy, revenue per hour, and having enough. So I'll just now get to your question of why does experience matter, right? That's that first driver of advisor well-being. And the reason is really just that there is no shortcut for getting the reps in and gaining experience with lots of different advisor tasks, right? Like handling different client scenarios, building trust, converting those leads into prospects, and then those prospects into clients. So, in other words, just the more effective that advisors feel at what they do, because they've built experience doing it again and again and again and again, results in greater well-being as a result. And you end up seeing this both in advisors with more years of industry experience have higher well-being, but you also see this in roles that are common among early career advisors, like associate advisors and service advisors. Advisors in those roles tend to have lower well-being than senior advisors who tend to be later in their career. And similarly, advisors who are at startup practices tend to have lower well-being than advisors working with established practice. So that's how this shows up in our data.
Yeah. So, if I'm early in my career, is there any way to compress that learning curve, or do you think it's just a matter of time?
Uh, okay. So so the fact that experience and specifically getting those reps in is a key driver of advisor well-being. So that offers some reason for advisors both to be happy and maybe to be a little bit discouraged. So it offers reasons for advisors to be happy because if you're an early career advisor and you're struggling, it really does get better from here, right? When you get after you get through those early years, you build up your client base. I promise it gets a whole lot easier. So that offers some reason for to be happy. But the downside, as you just noted, Alex, is there's really no shortcut for just getting the reps in, uh, having super awkward interactions with clients until you sort of figure out how to talk to them and build up your own style and all of that. Now, what I can say is that there are faster ways to develop than others. So the learning curve can be accelerated somewhat by not reinventing the wheel in terms of how to run your business, and instead looking at what the most successful advisors are doing, finding a practice you want to emulate, and then copying exactly what they do. Right. So instead of trying to discover for yourself, as it turns out, there's lots of people who've been through this before and trying to emulate what they do. And there's all sorts of ways you can do that, right? So part of the purpose of industry studies, like the ones we at kitsis.com put out, but also any other industry study, is to distill those trends and practices among the most successful advisors so you can find out what they're doing and copy them. And then similarly, many successful advisors have put out podcasts or books describing what they do. So while there's no shortcut to getting the reps in, what I would say is there's no need to reinvent the wheel if you're building your practice from scratch. Look at what the most successful advisors have done and just try to emulate how they've run their practices.
Yeah, I love that, and I really appreciate the work that you guys do for exactly that reason. Is the industry was not mentally well, I don't think, and candidly, when I started my career, I don't think it was the healthiest way to start. And I'm hopeful that as we seasoned advisors look back, we start to think, how can we make this a healthier profession for young people to join? How do we welcome them into our teams, bring them in, let them get more experience in a way that's not as pressure filled and where they can start building up those skills. So hopefully then when they start taking clients on themselves, it's not quite as uncomfortable because they've experienced it so many times.
Yeah, that's so well said. So maybe actually just to briefly expand on that point. So our industry has a little bit of what I like to call an accidental business owner dynamic. So what I mean by that is when we ask advisors, why are you an advisor in the first place? Decisively, the most common answers are I love helping and serving people, and personal finance is super interesting. So you have a lot of individuals, they enter the industry, let's say as a solo advisor, and they grow their practice, they bring on lots of clients, and then, eventually the client work starts to pile up. They need to offload it. They end up hiring, let's say, a CSA and then an associate advisor. Suddenly, you find out that financial advisor responsibilities are very, very different than manager responsibilities. Uh, Hiring, onboarding, training, development plans, performance reviews, and as a result, a lot of people are great advisors who give lots of wonderful advice to their clients, but they're not natural people managers. They entered the industry because they want to help and serve others, but as a result, they sort of fell into having to manage other people, and that's not a natural skill. So I think that's sort of one challenge that's very unique to our industry, but I think over time we're doing a little bit better.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a great point. I think it also segues us into the workplace conversation. And one thing that comes to mind for me is there are firms that take some of that off your plate. And there are some, if you're completely independent, where you can't, right? You're in charge of it. So, from your perspective, how much does the right workplace versus, as they're considering a transition, compensation is obviously top of mind as well, or something they're going to evaluate. What do you think the balance should be there between workplace and compensation?
Well, that's a good question. I think if what you're getting at by the question is do your job do workplace dynamics really matter if you're getting paid a lot? The short answer is yes, because as an advisor, you experience those workplace dynamics every single day. And whether they're good or whether they're terrible really impacts your well being. So, just some examples of workplace dynamics you talk about in the report, or just aspects of advisors' workplaces, are just the tech stacks that your firm uses. Whether advisors are able to work from their ideal environment. That is to say, if you want to work from home, you're working from home. If you want to work in a business office, you're working in a business office. Whether your firm has mission and value statements and meaningfully lives them out, whether you as an advisor are allowed to have a service team to leverage and support you, or you have to use some sort of centralized support. And then what you do with your working hours, right? If you get paid a lot but spend lots of time on work that makes you miserable, then you're not going to be very happy. So, at a high level, being at the right workplace matters a whole lot for advisor well-being. So I'm happy to expand on any of those buckets if you'd like.
Yeah, I think the hot topic at the moment's tech. So I'd be curious from your perspective, how does tech affect it? Are firms getting it right or wrong on the tech side?
Yeah. So again, just setting the stage here, we identify a very strong relationship between how satisfied advisors are with their tech and advisors' level of well-being. That is to say, if you love your tech, your well-being tends to be higher, but not necessarily in the way that many people might expect. And specifically, lots of advisors try to leverage technology to automate work that they don't like. In other words, they're trying to delegate that work to tech and get it off their plate. And we actually find very little evidence that advisors are effectively doing this. So, for example, I have an article on the kitsis.com platform, and it tallies up the number of pieces of individual efficiency boosting tech that advisors use and compares the amount of time advisors spend on admin and client service work based on whether they use very few pieces of efficiency boosting tech or whether they use lots and lots of efficiency boosting tech. And there's basically no difference whatsoever between the groups. And in fact, the best way for advisors to reduce their admin work or their client servicing work is to hire an associate advisor or a CSA, delegate it to them, and just make it their problem. We don't find much evidence that the advisors at this stage are effectively delegating a lot of this work to tech. And then similarly, in our research on advisor productivity, so we have a whole 60,000 word study on this subject, we do not find that good tech materially boosts advisor productivity in terms of the revenue that they can generate. So, what that means is that good tech does not materially lower admin work or increase revenue. Good tech literally just makes advisors happier because it gives them a better advisor experience and they're not pissed off for having to deal with tech that they don't like every single darn day.
Okay. So what I take away from that is tech is good, but I think or sounds like advisors are trying to use tech to replace hiring somebody or having that associate advisor or CSA. The reality is it'll be most efficient and effective for them if those two things are combined because it truly gets off their plate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the best way to get work you dislike off your plate is delegate it to another person. But tech really matters because advisors use tech all the time, right? I used to be an advisor. You're an advisor. That today, our research shows that the typical advisor uses 15 distinct pieces of software. 15, right? Being an advisor in the 21st century means you use tech a lot. And if that tech is great to use or if that tech is terrible, has a big impact on your well-being because you're interfacing it with it all day.
Makes sense to me. And I think sometimes you don't even realize that as you progress, right? You just it's part of your life. You don't even realize that you're using different tech until you're doing research on well what's out there, and then you learn a little bit more. So I think that all makes a lot of sense. So transitioning to autonomy, and I think autonomy and revenue per hour somewhat are self-explanatory, but would love to hear your thoughts on a little bit of a deeper level why you think that autonomy, let's start there, is so powerful for advisor well-being.
Sure. Well, one theme throughout our report is that there are things that drive well-being of everybody, and they also apply to advisors. So let me use the example of like just having control over your schedule, right? Which is just one very baseline measure of how much autonomy that you have. One thing we see in just general surveys of the US population is that individuals without a lot of control over their schedule, so think those with on call jobs who can just be called in at any moment, tend to have very low levels of well being, while white collar work from home employees tend to have very high levels of well being. And our research finds that this phenomenon among the general population holds for advisors too, predictably, right? So advisors that have more control over their schedules, so think you own a small practice, tend to report higher well-being than advisors such as maybe employee advisors, an advisor who works at a bank who may have very little control over their schedule. So again, with autonomy specifically, that's a great example of everybody loves autonomy. It makes most people happier, and of course that holds for advisors too.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I believe in the study, it said that advisor well-being peaks on 70 to 100 clients. Am I right there? Am I recollecting that correctly?
40 to 100.
40 to 100. Okay, so even less than I thought, because to me, that seems like a pretty tight crew. Autonomy
Yes.
correlates with that heavily because being able to have the freedom to actually take back your time, autonomy is useless if you have too many clients and you don't have the time anyways, right?
Yeah, that's well said. So maybe I can expand on this ideal number of clients. So
Please.
as you just noted, Alex, so in our report, we find that the happiest advisors, they're not those who just continually increase client headcount. They're those that rather than focusing on constantly acquiring new relationships, there are those that have a mature practice that aren't actively marketing their services anymore, although maybe they accept some inbound referrals here and there. And they have their core client base and they're just going deeper with the clients they already have. And the end result of which is that the sweet spot is 40 to 100 clients. Now, I will note where you fall within that range depends on your level of client affluence. So, as you likely know, the more affluent your clientele, the more time you have to spend per client. So if your typical client generates $40,000 a year or more in revenue, then you're going to be near the 40 end of that range. And similarly, if you tend to serve more mass affluent clients, you might be near the 100 end of that range. And notably, the boundaries of that range can shift a little bit depending on if you have a rock star team, if you have all of your processes in place, the boundaries can shift up a little bit. But the main point that we emphasize in the report is that the vast majority of advisors are happier going deeper with a set of great clients that pay them well for the work that they do than being constantly on the hunt. And that explanation isn't speculative because we literally ask advisors what makes you happier going deeper with your existing clients or steadily being on the hunt. And just over two-thirds of advisors say going deeper with their existing clients.
Yeah, that makes sense. What I love about what you guys do is you take the analytics and just explain it beautifully and connect it to the real world. And I think that's hard to do. So with revenue per hour, and this may be a brief one for you, but um, it fewer hours, I suppose. I mean, it makes sense when you think about any job, right? The less you work and the more effective you are, the happier you are. So are you seeing that there's advisors that are incredibly unhappy and what is the top end of how many hours people are putting in? Do you know that?
That is a good question. So we have um, a, a stat in the report. So we look at the top earning quartile. Okay, so the top earning quartile of advisors with very low well being earn more than the top earning quartile of advisors with very high well being. And the reason why is that the top earning quartile of advisors with very high well being, yes, they make a little bit less, but they work 4 days a week. The top earning quartile of advisors who have very low well-being, who are some of the highest earning advisors in our entire survey, earn so much because they work 50 hours a week. And actually, I think the exact number is 51 or 52. So just over 50 hours a week. So yes, the end result is if even if you're very financially successful, but you're financially successful because you're in the office very late during the week, maybe you're there on weekends, you're working very long hours, even though you're making more money doing that, you're putting yourself severely at risk of burnout.
Sense. Well, and I think that that perfectly glides us into the conversation of having enough. So, in the study, it mentions that there is a plateau of where higher income stops advancing your well-being. Why don't you dive into where that line is and why you think that is?
Sure. And Alex, this is another example of there's a trend among the general population that's also true of advisors. That is to say, for most adults, a greater income tends to correspond with being happier up to a certain point, and then it levels off. And what we find is that among advisors, well being rises until you earn about $500,000 a year in income. And then it ends up plateauing, which really just speaks to the fact that if your well being is tied to how much you earn, eventually your well being is just going to cap out and making more money isn't going to make you happier. And what that means is if you want to continue growing happier from there, you need to find sources of meaning and joy outside of your personal finances to continue growing happier because that additional income just doesn't yield gains in well-being.
Yeah. Okay. So then how should they reposition in their mind what is enough when it comes to the business side of things?
So there's no one size fits all answer here. Maybe what I can say just by way of a quick and dirty heuristic is that growth is great when it deepens your relationships, right, with clients, with family, etc. And growth is bad for well-being if it detracts from your relationships. So just like for example, when you grow to a point where you are no longer in the stressful startup stage of your business, when you have a client base that now pays you well for the work that you do, when you have a team that you can delegate tasks you find frustrating, when you have tech that you love, when you can leave a little bit early on Fridays. All of that helps you show up better for your clients and also your family because you're actually going home at a reasonable. All of that deepens your relationships and results in happier advisors. But advisors that grow at the expense of their relationships tend to be less happy. So actually the example of the ideal number of clients that we just got discussed maybe 5-10 minutes ago, that's a great example of this where you're constantly pursuing new relationships at the expense at the expense to some degree of your existing ones just because we all have the same finite number of hours in the day and days in the week. And or advisors that continually try to increase client headcount, what we end up finding is that they're less happy than advisors who go really deep on their core client base.
Okay. Yeah. So with lack of happiness comes sometimes burnout, right? And I'm a believer that every firm should have fulfillment as its north star for all employees, for all advisors. If we're living fulfilled lives, we're going to be happier, more efficient, more effective. What should firms take away from the connection between well-being and turnover?
Yes, good question. So just as background, so we put out 4 practice management studies on advisor productivity, tech, marketing, and well-being. And our well-being study gets the fewest views in terms of traffic. And that drives me crazy because advisor well-being is extremely important because well-being is a super important business lever for advisory firms to reduce turnover. So just a little bit of an eye-popping stat from the report that illustrates this is if you're an employee advisor and you have very high levels of well-being, turnover rate, so that's a 9 or a 10 on the Cantril ladder. Your turnover rate is less than 1%. Your expected turnover rate over 5 years. If you're an employee advisor among the lowest levels of well-being, your expected 5-year turnover rate is 21%. 21%, more than 1 in 5 of this group is expected to leave over 5 years because well being is so low. And as you know, as someone who works at a large advisory firm, the the costs of managing turnover are very high for firms. You have to continually dedicate resources and managerial attention towards rehiring and retraining for the same seats rather than focusing on the growth of the organization. And a key way firms can help mitigate the risk of turnover is by improving the well-being of their advisors.
Yeah. So even high performing advisors are still at risk of leaving. Why is that? I mean, can you give some color on it?
Yeah, actually, this is a good example of what I described earlier, where the highest earning quartile of advisors with low well being make more money than the highest earning quartile of advisors with high well being. But the reason that they make more money is that they're burning themselves out. So that's an example where if you just look at this advisor's revenue numbers and then just their take home income, it looks like they're doing great. But in reality, they are among the least happy segments of advisors that we surveyed in the report. And they are at much higher risk of burnout than advisors who make less money, but they're working manageable work, although still a lot of money, but are working manageable work hours.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting. So if you're a firm and you're looking at this situation, which is we could have highly successful, highly productive individuals working for us that might leave, right? We might burn them out. What's the first lever that you're looking at? Is it technology? You reference that that's a huge pain point and a huge lever for well-being. What if you're a firm leader, what are you looking at and saying, this is what I have to put my attention on to increase advisor well-being?
Yeah. I would look at team first and foremost. And the reason is that, so if you look at unsupported solo advisors, just they by definition have to do all of the admin and client servicing work and they can't delegate it. And one of the strongest drivers of advisor well-being in that we identify in the report is reducing time on admin work. Advisors who do the most admin work are the least happy and the most likely to leave their existing firms, while advisors that spend the least amount of time on admin are the happiest and the most likely to stick around. So the first place I would look is team. And specifically, if you're an unsupported solo advisor, you want a team around you to leverage and support you. However, very often advisory firms think that larger teams necessarily correspond with more productive advisors. And that isn't true. And part of the reason that isn't true is because there are certain challenges that larger teams face that end up hindering advisors' productivity and well being. And specifically, one of those challenges we call the management tax, which is very straightforward. If you're a senior advisor and you run a very large team, you have to spend a lot of time managing the team. That includes both delegating work, but then again, also hiring, onboarding, performance reviews, answering questions about benefits, whatever. So in that management tax, because the amount of time you have to spend on management duties comes at the expense of, crowds out time you could spend growing the firm. So that's number one, the management tax. Another challenge among very large teams is the shared clients tax. And specifically, this involves for teams with multiple lead advisors, the advisors often redundantly allocate their time. Think two advisors in a meeting where only one advisor needs to be present. And that ends up harming the productivity of the firm. So what our research indicates is that the sweet spot for the size of service teams is three people that follows a triangle structure. That is to say, the senior advisor at the top of the triangle, supported by an associate advisor and a service advisor at the bottom of the triangle. And that support structure helps senior advisors not burn out and be able to delegate work they don't enjoy off their plate, right? Maybe the admin work to the CSA, some of the trading and rebalancing work to the associate advisor. But the team isn't so large that your productivity is hindered by the management tax and the shared clients tax. So um, I would say I would caution larger firms against larger service teams, and the happiest advisors are those on a lean 3-person service team, not those on necessarily very large teams.
That's fascinating. So from a practice management standpoint, practice design you think is the most impactful change that firms can start to make? Is let's enlighten our advisors of what the most efficient team looks like, and that'll bring along their well-being as well.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. I think it's interesting too. In the study, it references compliance, and I know you and I had talked about this offline, but to me, we partner with an independent broker dealer, and they take on the compliance. And where some people, I suppose, in an RA setting, are saying, "Well, I just want complete freedom." I personally appreciate the load that it takes off of me and also the stress that it takes off of me because I don't ever want to make a mistake or, if I ever made a mistake, it would be something incidental. It wouldn't be intentional. And the independent broker dealer handles that for me and they'll alert me if there's anything that's even, borderline. So from your standpoint, you work heavily with RAs, you're very knowledgeable. That compliance factor, how does that weigh in here?
Yeah, that's well said. So ultimately, the amount of time advisors spend on compliance, as I noted earlier, if you spend a lot of time on compliance work, you tend to have lower levels of well being. And in practice, what that means is advisors exclusively affiliated with an independent RIA who are not affiliated with a broker dealer, who are not duly registered, tend to report the highest levels of well being. So that's something we've replicated now across our last four reports on this subject.
Amazing. Well, Mark, I really, really appreciate your time. This is so valuable for all the advisors out there and candidly firm leaders out there, I think, as well. If you leave us with one parting piece, if you were an advisor out there and you wanted to live a more fulfilling life and have a more fulfilling practice, what's the number one change you'd consider tomorrow?
I'll give a short term fix, something that you could implement immediately, and then I'll give maybe a longer term move. So the short term fix is join a membership organization like FPA, NAFA, XYPN, and connect with your advisor peers. Because again, one consistent finding in our research is that advisors with membership in pretty much any of these organizations who regularly network and connect with their advisor peers have much higher well-being than advisors that are not in any of these organizations. And that's something where you can flip the switch relatively quickly. In terms of something that takes more time, I would just reiterate my note earlier about the size of service teams, where most firms do recognize that unsupported solo advisors tend to be less productive because there's just by definition nobody who they can delegate work to focus on like admin and client servicing work to focus on growing the firm. But just very often firms think larger service teams are better. And what our data shows is that the happiest advisors work at a lean three-person team, ideally following that triangle structure with the senior advisor, associate advisor, and CSA, and then have that three-person triangle team be your North Star. And then as service teams accumulate clients and start to grow, that's a sign for maybe the associate advisor to spin off and form a new service team that again grows until it reaches a three-person structure. So those are the two items that I would note.
Awesome. One last thing. As you noted, not enough eyes are on the well being study. Why don't you tell them quickly where they can find that?
Sure. Anybody can access our well-being study at kitsis.com/wellbeing. It's there available free to the public. You don't even have to give us your email. You can just download it straight from that page.
A rarity today to not have to give up your email. And I'll say I've read through it and got so much value from it. So, Mark, thank you again for your time today. And listeners, thank you again for visiting on another episode of Beyond the Trees. We'll see you next time.